In the last couple of modules of this lecture, we've been talking about terminology for identifying and differentiating different kinds of arguments and differentiating good from bad arguments, arguments that have their defect in a particular component like the logical form, and so on. Now we're going to turn our attention to what are called fallacies. So what is a fallacy? Well, a fallacy is a defective argument. Fallacies are defective arguments in that they fail to establish their conclusion in the context of their use. So using those evaluative terms from the last couple of lecture modules, we can say that most fallacies are going to be unsound or uncogent arguments. Now, fallacies fall into two general categories. Formal fallacies are invalid deductive arguments. So they're unsuccessful arguments. Their defect can be discovered by examining their underlying logical structure. That is, they are invalid deductive arguments, and so they fail because of their logical form, formal fallacy. Other fallacies are different. In some cases, the presentation of the argument obscures its defect, so that it seems like a much better argument than it actually is. It may seem successful when it's actually not a successful argument. And we're only going to discover the defect, we're only going to see why the argument isn't actually successful by taking the content and the context of the use of that argument into account, by examining the argument in the context, and using the content of that specific version of the argument. Since the defect in these arguments isn't found exclusively in their logical form, logicians name these arguments informal fallacies. Now, informal fallacies could include both deductive and inductive arguments, but as we've seen before in this chapter, Perry and his co-authors focus on deductive fallacies. The first fallacy they look at is called the fallacy of begging the question. It's an informal fallacy, and you commit the fallacy of begging the question when the premises you use to try and establish your conclusion are at least as contentious in the context of the argument as the conclusion itself. So you're trying to establish some conclusion, and the reasons that you give are just as in need of reasons or of evidence as the conclusion itself, and hence can't really support the conclusion. In the most extreme form of begging the question, one argues circularly. That is, one assumes the conclusion in order to prove the conclusion. So one establishes one's conclusion by assuming that it's true. So here's a particularly simplistic version of begging the question that is in that circularity camp. So suppose I want to prove that I'm God. Clearly, this isn't going to be really possible in the world. I have no qualities of a deity at all. But suppose I want to prove that I'm God anyway. I want to do it in a way that looks successful maybe, but maybe isn't. So I'll just assume that I'm God. So suppose I'm God. Well, then it would just follow that I'm God. Now, as I said, this is a very simplistic version of begging the question, because no one who doesn't already buy into my status as a deity, that is, thinks the conclusion is true, is going to find the argument convincing, is going to accept the premise and then see the premise guarantees the conclusion is true and accept the conclusion. Why? Well, it's the same phrasing. It's just the assertion of a statement in the premise and in the conclusion. But of course, begging the question, even cases of circularity, can be much more subtle and sophisticated. Our authors give us a more subtle example of begging the question on page 11. So they say, the Bible says that God exists. Everything the Bible says is true, therefore God exists. Now, this is a case of begging the question, because if you don't believe in the existence of the Judeo-Christian deity, right, if this argument is directed at someone who's not a believer, then chances are they don't accept premise number 2 either, right? So they probably don't think that everything that the Judeo-Christian Bible says is true. And hence, they may think that the Bible says God exists, but they don't think that everything the Bible says is true, and so they don't have evidence that compels them to believe that the Judeo-Christian God exists. Now, the next two fallacies that we're going to look at involve what are called conditional statements. Conditional statements are statements that relate the truth values of two component statements. So a conditional statement relates the truth of one statement, called the consequent, to the truth of another statement, called the antecedent. Conditional statements will often use a locution, like if, then. And I've color-coded it to associate if with an antecedent and then with a consequent. So a conditional statement makes an assertion that if the antecedent is true, so the truth of the antecedent implies, guarantees the truth of the conclusion, then the conclusion is true. So there's a directionality. If the antecedent is true, the consequent is true. So an instance or an example of a conditional statement would be, if an argument is a formal fallacy, then it is an invalid deductive argument. So this is the true conditional statement. The antecedent is that if part, the first part in light blue. If an argument is a formal fallacy. The consequent is the darker blue part, then it's an invalid deductive argument. Consequent follows from is true when the antecedent is true. In the next module, we'll look at the two conditional fallacies that the authors discuss in the chapter.